For as long as I could remember, the small creek that ran through my backyard had been my sanctuary. It wasn't much to look at, just a narrow ribbon of water that meandered through the trees, barely deep enough to wet your ankles. But to me, it was everything. After long days working as a plumber, fixing other people's leaky pipes and clogged drains, I would sit by the creek and let the sound of the babbling water wash away my stress. The creek was alive with tiny creatures, frogs, minnows, and dragonflies that fascinated the neighborhood kids. It was a place of peace, a slice of nature in the middle of our suburban neighborhood. That all changed the day the Maple Valley Homeowners Association, HOA, came knocking. The first sign of trouble arrived in the mile-thick envelope with Maple Valley Homeowners Association printed in gold letters. Inside was a welcome letter explaining that our previously unregulated neighborhood had been incorporated into the existing Maple Valley HOA. Attached were pages of rules and regulations, from grass height to holiday decorations. At the bottom was a signature line with a note: "Failure to return signed agreement within 30 days constitutes acceptance of terms." I tossed it aside, planning to ignore it. But 3 days later, Karen Westfield, the HOA's Community Standards Director, appeared at my door. "Good afternoon," she said, her smile tight and practiced. "I noticed you haven't returned your membership agreement." "I'm not interested in joining," I said simply. Her smile didn't waver. "I'm afraid it's not optional. Your property deed includes a provision allowing for HOA formation if 75 fan tram of area homeowners agree, and we've reached that threshold." I reluctantly signed the papers, but my stomach churned as I handed them over. Something about this felt wrong. The first HOA meeting was held in the community center. Karen stood at the front beside her husband, Richard Westfield, the HOA president. They talked about property values, mailbox standardization, and approved fence heights. Then Karen clicked to a new slide in her presentation, a photo of my backyard. "Moving on to safety concerns," she said. "This unauthorized water feature on Elm Street poses an immediate drowning risk to children." I stood up. "That's my property, and that's a natural creek that's been there for decades. It's not a feature I installed. The bylaws clearly state all water features must be approved and properly fenced," Karen replied, not bothering to address my point. Mrs. Thompson, whose children often played in the creek, raised her hand. "My children play in that creek all the time. It's perfectly safe." Karen's eyes narrowed. "And do you have liability insurance covering potential accidents on Mr. Jackson's property?" The room fell silent. After the meeting, I decided to investigate. I followed the creek upstream, beyond my property line, and discovered a drainage pipe hidden by cattails. The pipe fed directly into my creek from a retention pond behind the newer homes where the Westfields and other HOA board members lived. I snapped photos and followed the pipe back toward the houses. As I was documenting the pipe, I saw Richard Westfield drive up to the pond in a golf cart. He looked around carefully, then dumped something from a container into the water. When he drove away, I crept forward and shined my light on the pond's surface. Dead fish floated belly up where he had poured whatever was in that container. My phone buzzed with a text from Elaine Wong, my neighbor. "Check your email. HOA just sent violation notice. 500 fine for an water feature. Says drain creek in 30 days or 500 fine for an water feature. Says drain creek in 30 days or 100 daily penalty." The HOA hired contractors to divert my creek underground. By morning, my beautiful creek bed lay empty and dry. I felt hollow inside as I walked the dead creek bed, picking up stranded minnows and relocating them to a bucket of water. The Thompson children helped silently, their faces solemn as they saved what creatures they could. 3 days later, as a storm intensified, I was awakened at 2 a.m. by frantic pounding on my door. It was Elaine, soaking wet and wide-eyed. "You need to see this," she gasped. We followed the sound of rushing water to the newest section of the development. Water bubbled up through storm drains, flooding the street ankle-deep. Several homeowners were outside with flashlights, desperately trying to direct water away from their foundations. And there, in the center of it all, stood the Westfields in matching monogrammed raincoats, shouting at someone on his phone while Karen directed neighbors to place sandbags around their property. The sewers were backing up, and 3 houses already had basement flooding. I remembered Dr. Martinez's words. Water follows the path of least resistance. With my creek gone, the groundwater had found a new route right under the homes of those who had destroyed its natural path. The neighborhood was in chaos. Basements flooded, foundations cracked, and insurance companies denied claims. The HOA held an emergency meeting, but the room erupted in anger as homeowners demanded answers. I stood up and connected my laptop to the projector. "I've been researching our neighborhood's geological history," I said. "What we're experiencing isn't unprecedented at all." I showed historical maps of the area dating back to 1962, before development began. Our entire neighborhood was built on natural wetlands. The developers installed drainage systems, including natural waterways like the creek on my property. When the HOA ordered me to remove my creek last week, I continued, they eliminated a critical drainage point. Water always follows the path of least resistance in this case, right under the foundations of homes built on filled-in wetlands. The room erupted. Parents whose children had supposedly been at risk from my creek now faced thousands in water damage. Homeowners who had remained silent during pre-VYS HOA overreach were suddenly demanding answers. The county engineers arrived the next morning, taking soil samples and conducting ground surveys. Their official report arrived 3 days later, damning the HOA for the unauthorized modification of natural drainage systems. The neighborhood group chat pinged with an urgent message from Elaine: "Emergency meeting at my house tomorrow. Do not discuss on this chat. Spread the word personally." I sensed a revolution brewing. The water that once flowed peacefully through my land was about to become a flood of change that even Karen and Richard couldn't control. At the meeting, we formed a plan. We created a group chat called Weekend Gardening Club to avoid suspicion. On Saturday morning, 20 of us gathered with shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, claiming to be working on the community garden plot. We split into teams and tackled the drainage points, revealing the original stream beds that had been covered with construction trash. Karen and Richard arrived, furious. "This is vandalism," Karen shouted. I walked over calmly, covered in mud but smiling. "Hello, Karen. We're just helping maintain proper drainage as per Section 12.3 of the HOA bylaws." I handed her a laminated copy. It clearly states homeowners may perform maintenance on drainage systems to preserve property values. By evening, we had completed 3 critical drainage channels. That night, rain pounded against my windows. I couldn't sleep, wondering if our work would help or make things worse. At dawn, I walked through the neighborhood. Where before there had been street flooding, now the water flowed smoothly through our newly restored channels. I followed the main path all the way to its endpoint, the Westfield's backyard. There, where Karen had once hosted her prize-winning garden parties, stood a perfect, pristine pond with water gently flowing through it, exactly as the original wetland had been. The story aired on the local news that evening. The HOA held an emergency meeting, but the room was filled with angry homeowners clutching papers and wearing furious expressions. Elaine stood up, holding a thick folder. "I have copies of the environmental impact study that was submitted before the creek diversion," she said. "It specifically warned of potential flooding if the natural watershed was disrupted." She began passing out pages. "And here are the emails showing the board received and ignored these warnings." The room erupted. Parents whose children had been traumatized by flooding, elderly residents whose irreplaceable belongings were ruined, families living in hotels while mold was removed from their homes, all shouting questions at once. Finally, Taylor Williams stood on a chair and whistled loudly. The room quieted. "We've prepared a petition," she announced, while viewing a stack of papers. "It calls for immediate board elections and has been signed by over 75 fan tram of homeowners. According to HOA bylaws, that's enough to force a vote tonight." The vote wasn't even close. Elaine became president, with Michael and Taylor elected to the board. Their first official act was to approve a comprehensive water management plan that included restoring my creek. Months later, I sat by my flowing creek, watching tadpoles dart between rocks. The water caught sunlight, throwing sparkles against the banks where native plants had returned. Neighborhood kids had built a small bridge downstream where they now watched for frogs under their parents' watchful eyes. The Westfields had sold their house at a loss and moved away. The new owners embraced the wetland restoration project, even adding bird feeders to attract more wildlife. "It looks like it was always meant to be here," said Elaine, joining me beside the creek. "Because it was," I nodded, dipping my fingers in the cool water. "How's the class action lawsuit going?" she asked. "Settlement talks start next week. The HOA insurance is covering most damages." A blue heron landed gracefully at the water's edge, studying its reflection before stabbing at a small fish. "You know," Elaine said quietly, "Karen left something behind when she moved." "What's that?" "A sign. It was in her garage. It said, 'Danger, water hazard. Keep children away.'" Elaine smiled. "I put it up by the community garden with a new sign underneath that says, 'Nature, not a danger, but a teacher.'" I laughed, watching the water flow freely where it had always been meant to go. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or rules, but simply from letting nature take its course. What would our world look like if we stopped fighting against it and started working with it instead? The restoration of the creek marked a new beginning for our neighborhood, but the ripple effects of our battle with the HOA continued to spread. The class action lawsuit against the HOA gained momentum, and news outlets from across the state began covering our story. Reporters dug into the history of the Maple Valley HOA, uncovering a pattern of overreach, corruption, and environmental negligence. Karen and Richard Westfield, once untouchable figures in our community, found themselves at the center of a media storm. The settlement talks began, and the HOA's insurance company quickly realized the extent of their liability. Homeowners who had suffered flood damage were compensated, and the HOA was forced to pay for the restoration of the creek and other natural drainage systems in the neighborhood. But the financial cost was only part of the story. The real story was the shift in power. The new HOA board, led by Elaine, Michael, and Taylor, prioritized transparency, community input, and environmental stewardship. Elaine wasted no time implementing changes. She organized a series of town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns and ideas. One of the first initiatives was the creation of a neighborhood conservation committee, tasked with preserving and enhancing the natural features of our community. I was invited to join, along with Dr. Martinez, the environmental science professor who had supported our cause. The committee's first project was to expand the restored creek into a full-fledged wetland area. We planted native vegetation, installed birdhouses, and created walking paths for residents to enjoy. The wetland became a hub of activism, attracting not only wildlife, but also families who wanted to reconnect with nature. The Thompson children, who had been so heartbroken when the creek was drained, were now its biggest advocates, leading guided tours for their friends and classmates. As our neighborhood flourished, the Westfields' lives unraveled. The media scrutiny and legal battles took a toll on their reputation and finances. Richard, who had always been the face of the HOA, resigned from his position and retreated from public life. Karen, once a domineering presence, became a recluse, rarely seen outside her home. One evening, as I was walking along the creek, I noticed a for sale sign in front of the Westfields' house. The grand home that had once symbolized their power now stood empty, a reminder of their hubris. The new owners, a young couple with a passion for sustainability, embraced the wetland restoration project and even volunteered to help maintain the creek. The changes in our neighborhood went beyond the physical landscape. The fight for the creek had brought us together, forging bonds that went beyond mere proximity. We organized block parties, community cleanups, and even a neighborhood-wide potluck where everyone brought a dish made with ingredients from their gardens. The sense of camaraderie was palpable, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were truly a community. One of the most heartwarming developments was the creation of a neighborhood scholarship fund. Inspired by the Thompson children's love for the creek, we decided to award an annual scholarship to a local student pursuing environmental science or conservation. The fund was financed through community donations and a portion of the HOA's settlement money. As the years passed, the creek became more than just a natural feature, it became a symbol of resilience and hope. Schools organized field trips to the wetland, and local environmental groups used it as a case study for sustainable development. The story of our neighborhood's fight against the HOA was even featured in a documentary, which premiered at a local film festival. I continued to sit by the creek every evening, watching the water flow and reflecting on how far we had come. The creek had always been there, quietly sustaining the land, but it took a crisis to remind us of its importance. In SAVYing the creek, we had saved ourselves, and in the process, we had created a community that valued nature, justice, and each other. One summer afternoon, as I was sitting by the creek, I noticed a group of children gathered near the water's edge. They were crouched low, peering into the water with wide eyes. Curious, I walked over to see what had captured their attention. "Look, Mr. Jackson," one of the kids exclaimed, pointing to a cluster of tadpoles swimming near the bank. "They're going to be frogs soon." I smiled, remembering how Timmy and Sarah Thompson had once been just as excited about the creek. The next generation had taken up the mantle, and it was clear that the creek would continue to be a source of wonder and inspiration for years to come. As I watched the children explore, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The creek had not only survived but thrived, and so had we. The battle had been long and difficult, but in the end, we had proven that even the smallest voices could make a difference. The documentary about our neighborhood's fight to save the creek gained national attention. It was picked up by a major streaming platform, and suddenly, our little community was thrust into the spotlight. Reporters from across the country reached out, wanting to interview us about our story over the HOA and the restoration of the wetland. Elaine, Michael, and I found ourselves on morning talk shows, podcasts, and even a segment on a popular news magazine program. The attention was overwhelming but also empowering. Our story resonated with people who had faced similar battles with HOAs or environmental negligence. We received letters and emails from individuals and communities who had been inspired by our fight. Some shared their own stories of standing up to powerful organizations, while others asked for advice on how to protect their natural resources. One email, in particular, stood out. It was from a small town in Oregon where a developer was planning to drain a wetland to build a shopping mall. The town's residents were organizing to stop the project, and they wanted our help. Elaine and I decided to visit the town, bringing with us the lessons we had learned from our own struggle. The town in Oregon was a stark contrast to our suburban neighborhood. Nestled in a valley surrounded by forests, it was a place where nature still held sway. But the proposed development threatened to destroy a wetland that was home to endangered species and served as a critical floodplain for the area. We met with the town's residents, sharing our story and offering advice on how to organize and advocate for their cause. They had already formed a coalition, but they lacked the experience and resources to take on the developer and the local government. Elaine and I helped them draft a petition, organize protests, and reach out to environmental organizations for support. The battle was intense, but the town's residents were determined. They held community meetings, invited experts to speak about the ecological importance of the wetland, and even staged a sit-in at the developer's office. The media coverage we brought with us helped amplify their message, and soon, the story gained national attention. After months of fighting, the town won a major victory. The developer withdrew their plans, and the wetland was designated as a protected area. It was a bittersweet moment for Elaine and me. We were proud of what we had accomplished, but we also knew that the fight to protect the environment was far from over. Our involvement in the Oregon campaign marked the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. Elaine, Michael, and I decided to formalize our efforts by creating a nonprofit organization called the Ripple Effect. The organization's mission was to support communities fighting to protect their natural resources and to advocate for sustainable development practices. We hired a small staff and set up an office in our neighborhood, using part of the settlement money from the HOA lawsuit to fund our operations. The Ripple Effect quickly gained traction, attracting volunteers and donations from across the country. We launched a website where communities could share their stories, access resources, and connect with experts in environmental law and conservation. One of our first major projects was a nationwide campaign to reform HOA regulations. We worked with lawmakers to draft legislation that would limit the power of HOAs to override environmental protections and give homeowners more rights to protect their properties. The campaign gained bipartisan support, and within a year, several states had passed laws that reflected our proposals. Back in our neighborhood, the creek continued to thrive. The wetland area we had restored became a model for sustainable urban planning, attracting VY-siders from across the region. Schools and universities used it as a VYing laboratory, and local artists created murals and sculptures that celebrated its beauty and significance. The Thompson children, now teenagers, became ambassadors for the creek, leading educational tours and organizing cleanup events. Timmy, who had once been heartbroken over the loss of the frogs, was now studying environmental science in college, with dreams of becoming a conservation biologist. The creek also became a symbol of healing for our community. The scars of the flood and the battle with the HOA faded, replaced by a sense of pride and unity. We had faced a crisis and emerged stronger, more connected, and more committed to protecting the things that mattered most. As the years passed, the ripple effect grew into a powerful force for change. We expanded our work to include international projects, partnering with communities in developing countries to protect their natural resources and promote sustainable livelihoods. Elaine, Michael, and I traveled the world, sharing our story and learning from others who were fighting similar battles. But no matter how far we traveled, the creek remained at the heart of everything we did. It was a constant reminder of why we had started this journey and what we were fighting for. Every time I sat by the water, watching the sunlight dance on its surface, I felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. One evening, as I was walking along the creek, I noticed a group of children gathered near the water's edge. They were crouched low, peering into the water with wide eyes. Curious, I walked over to see what had captured their attention. "Look, Mr. Jackson," one of the kids exclaimed, pointing to a cluster of tadpoles swimming near the bank. "They're going to be frogs soon." I smiled, remembering how Timmy and Sarah Thompson had once been just as excited about the creek. The next generation had taken up the mantle, and it was clear that the creek would continue to be a source of wonder and inspiration for years to come. Just when we thought our neighborhood had found peace, a new threat emerged. A large development company, Green Horizon, announced plans to build a massive housing complex on the outskirts of our community. The proposed site included a forested area that served as a buffer zone for our wetland and creek. The development would not only destroy the forest, but also disrupt the natural water flow, potentially endangering the creek once again. The news spread quickly, and the neighborhood was DVY dead. Some residents saw the development as an opportunity for economic growth, while others feared the environmental consequences. Elaine, now the president of the HOA, called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. "We fought too hard to protect our creek," Elaine said, addressing the crowded community center. "We can't let this development undo everything we've accomplished." But not everyone agreed. A group of residents, led by a newcomer named Greg Harris, argued that the development would bring jobs and increase property values. "We can't live in the past," Greg said. "Progress is INEVY table." The tension in the room was palpable. It felt like the old days, when the neighborhood was DVY dead over the creek. But this time, we had the experience and the tools to fight back. Elaine, Michael, and I knew we couldn't face this new threat alone. We reached out to our network of environmental organizations, legal experts, and community activists. Together, we formed a coalition to oppose the development. Our first step was to gather data. We commissioned an environmental impact study, which confirmed our worst fears. The development would disrupt the natural water flow, increase the risk of flooding, and destroy critical habitat for wildlife. Armed with this information, we launched a public awareness campaign, using social media, local news outlets, and community events to spread the word. We also organized a series of town hall meetings, inviting experts to speak about the potential consequences of the development. Dr. Martinez, who had supported us during the creek battle, returned to explain the ecological importance of the forest and wetland. His presentation was powerful, but it wasn't enough to sway everyone. Greg Harris and his supporters continued to push for the development, arguing that the economic benefits outweighed the environmental risks. The debate grew heated, and the neighborhood was once again on the brink of DVY shutdown. The turning point came when we discovered that Green Horizon had a history of environmental violations. Through our network of activists, We obtained documents showing that the company had been fined multiple times for illegal dumping, deforestation, and water pollution. We shared this information with the media, and the story quickly gained traction. The revelation shifted public opinion. Even some of Greg's supporters began to question the wisdom of allowing Green Horizon to develop in our community. The local government, under pressure from residents and the media, announced a public hearing to re-evaluate the development proposal. The hearing was packed with residents, environmental advocates, and reporters. Elaine, Michael, and I presented our findings, emphasizing the potential risks to the creek and the broader ecosystem. Greg and his supporters argued their case, but the evidence against Green Horizon was overwhelming. In the end, the local government voted to reject the development proposal. It was a major victory, but we knew the fight wasn't over. Green Horizon had deep pockets and a reputation for getting what they wanted. We had to stay vigilant. Green Horizon didn't give up easily. They filed an appeal, claiming that the local government's decision was based on misinformation and emotional appeals. The legal battle dragged on for months, draining our resources and testing our resolve. But we had learned from our previous battles. We knew the importance of staying organized and maintaining public support. We continued to hold community events, highlighting the beauty and importance of the creek and forest. We also reached out to other communities that had successfully fought off similar developments, learning from their experiences and strategies. The legal battle finally came to a head in a state court, where a judge ruled in our favor. The decision was a landmark victory, setting a precedent for future cases involving environmental protection and community rights. With the threat of development behind us, we turned our attention to the future. Elaine proposed a new initiative, transforming the forested area into a community nature reserve. The reserve would be protected from future development and open to the public for recreation and education. The proposal received overwhelming support from the neighborhood. We raised funds through grants, donations, and community events, and within a year, the reserve was a reality. It featured walking trails, educational signage, and a small sighting center where residents could learn about the local ecosystem. The reserve became a source of pride for the community, attracting sighters from across the region. Schools organized field trips, and local artists created installations that celebrated the natural beauty of the area. The creek, once a source of conflict, was now the heart of a thriving ecosystem. As the years passed, a new generation of leaders emerged in our community. Timmy Thompson, now a young environmental scientist, returned to the neighborhood after completing his degree. He joined the Ripple Effect, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the organization. Under Timmy's leadership, we expanded our work to include climate resilience projects, helping communities prepare for the impacts of climate change. We also launched a youth program, teaching the next generation about environmental stewardship and community activism. The creek continued to be a source of inspiration and education. Every year, we held a Creek Day celebration, where residents came together to clean up the area, plant native species, and celebrate the natural beauty of our community. One evening, as I sat by the creek, I reflected on the journey we had taken. The creek had been the catalyst for so much change, not just in our neighborhood, but in our lives. It had taught us the importance of standing up for what we believed in, of working together, and of protecting the things that mattered most. Elaine joined me, her hair now streaked with gray, but her spirit as strong as ever. "We've come a long way," she said, gazing at the water. "We have," I replied. "But the work's not done. There will always be new challenges, new threats." "True," Elaine said, "but we've built something that will last. The creek, the reserve, the community, it's all part of a legacy that will continue long after we're gone." As the sun set, casting a golden glow on the water, I felt a deep sense of peace. The creek had always been there, quietly flowing, but it had taken a crisis to remind us of its importance. In saving the creek, we had saved ourselves, and in the process, we had created a community that valued nature, justice, and each other. The story of our neighborhood's fight for the creek became a beacon of hope for other communities facing similar challenges. People from across the country reached out to us, asking for advice on how to stand up to powerful organizations or protect their natural resources. Elaine, Michael, and I became reluctant activists, sharing our story at conferences and workshops. But the true legacy of the creek was the way it brought us together. It reminded us that we were not just neighbors, but stewards of the land, responsible for preserving it for future generations. The creek had always been there, quietly flowing, but it took a crisis to remind us of its importance. As I sat by the water one last time, I thought about the ripple effect, how one small action could create waves that changed everything. The creek had been the catalyst, but the real change came from within us. We had learned to listen to each other, to stand up for what was right, and to work together for a common cause. And as the water continued to flow, I knew that the ripple would never end. It would continue to spread, touching lives and inspiring change long after I was gone. Because in the end, water always finds its way. And so do we. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.